Every empire in history believed it would last forever. Every single one was wrong. In the next 12 minutes, you are going to watch 9 of the greatest empires ever built come apart, one by one. Not the version from your school books, written like marketing. The real invoice. The droughts, the deaths, the betrayals, the rivers turned against cities, the room filled with gold that saved no one. And as the list goes on, watch closely, because almost all of them made the same mistake right before the end. By the last one, you will see it coming before the empire does. Let us start at the very beginning, with the first empire the world ever knew, killed by something no army could fight.
The Akkadian Empire. Around 2300 BC, Sargon of Akkad did something no ruler had ever done. He conquered city after city in Mesopotamia and stitched them into the first empire in human history. It lasted less than 2 centuries. Around 2150 BC, Akkad collapsed, and for 4,000 years, nobody knew why. Then scientists started reading lake beds, ice cores, and fossil corals in the Gulf of Oman and found the fingerprint of a megadrought that struck around 4,200 years ago and lasted for generations. Rain failed. The northern plains emptied. Refugees flooded south by the thousands. The Mesopotamians themselves wrote a poem about it, The Curse of Akkad, in which the fields refused to grow grain.
Some scientists still debate how global that drought really was, and honest history says so. But the first empire on Earth was most likely killed by the weather. The next one was killed by everyone it had ever hurt, all at once. The Assyrian Empire ruled the Near East with a cruelty so deliberate it was policy. Deportations, burned cities, torture carved proudly into palace walls. At its peak, it seemed untouchable. Then its enemies did the one thing Assyria never planned for. They teamed up. In 612 BC, the Medes and the Babylonians marched on Nineveh, the greatest city in the world, together. The siege lasted 3 months. Ancient sources say the attackers turned the river Kos itself against the walls, flooding the foundations until they gave way. The king died in his burning capital, and within just a few years, the empire that had terrorized the ancient world simply stopped existing. Erased so completely that when Greek soldiers marched past the ruins 2 centuries later, they did not even know what city it had been. Rome would take much longer to build, and much, much longer to die. The Western Roman Empire did not fall in a day. It bled out over centuries, and one of its deepest wounds was money. In its early days, the silver denarius was nearly pure. By the crisis of the 3rd century, emperors desperate to pay their armies had stripped its silver content to under 5%. It was a coin pretending to be a coin, and prices exploded. Add plagues, civil wars, and frontiers too long to defend, and the ending almost writes itself. In 476, a Germanic officer named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, and did not even bother to take the imperial title. Historians still argue whether Rome fell, transformed, or faded, but here is the detail your teacher skipped. Rome's eastern half watched all of it happen, took notes, and survived for another 1,000 years. We will come back for it. First, the empire that vanished into the jungle. The Maya were not one empire, but a constellation of powerful city-states, and their classic civilization built astronomy, mathematics, and cities of stone in the middle of the rainforest. Then, between roughly 800 and 900 AD, the great southern cities went silent one by one. Monuments stopped being carved. Palaces were abandoned to the trees. Cities like Tikal, home to tens of thousands, emptied out so completely that the forest swallowed their pyramids whole, and outsiders would not find some of them again for 1,000 years.
Evidence from lake sediments points again to waves of severe drought, layered on top of warfare and strained farmland. But do not call it a disappearance. The Maya people never vanished.
Millions of their descendants live today, speaking Mayan languages, which makes this the rare collapse where the empire died and the people simply outlived it. The next city on our list did not go quietly. It went down firing the largest cannon on Earth. Well, facing it.
Constantinople, 1453. The Byzantine Empire, that surviving eastern half of Rome, was now a 1,000-year-old city wrapped around a dying state. Outside its legendary triple walls stood Mehmed II, a sultan 21 years old, with an army vast beyond counting and a secret weapon. A bombard so enormous it needed dozens of oxen to move, hurling stone balls that shook walls which had repelled every siege for a millennium. When the Great Chain blocked his fleet from the harbor, Mehmed had his ships dragged overland, across greased logs, over a hill, and dropped into the water on the other side. After a siege of 53 days, the walls broke. The last emperor of Rome died fighting at the breach, and 11 centuries of Roman history ended in a single morning.
And yet the largest empire on this list was not beaten by cannons or walls. It was beaten by a family argument. The Mongol Empire, at its height, stretched from Korea to the gates of Europe. Roughly 23 million square kilometers, the largest contiguous empire ever assembled, built in a single lifetime by Genghis Khan and his sons. It survived every enemy army it ever faced. What it could not survive was a succession. When the great Khan Möngke died in 1259, his brothers went to war over the throne, and the empire that had conquered the world split into 4 rival khanates that never truly reunited. Within a few generations, the whole vast machine had dissolved into separate kingdoms. Every empire on this list feared its neighbors. The Mongols proved the deadliest enemy is usually at your own table.
The next 2 empires fell to the same storm, an ocean apart within 12 years of each other. Tenochtitlan, capital of the Aztec Empire, was a city on a lake, home to perhaps 200,000 people, larger than almost any city in Europe. It had canals instead of streets, floating gardens that fed the city, and causeways wide enough for 10 horses. The Spaniards who saw it wrote that it looked like an enchanted vision, and some asked if they were dreaming. 2 years later, they destroyed it. Hernán Cortés arrived with only a few hundred Spanish soldiers, but he did not conquer Mexico with a few hundred men. He conquered it with tens of thousands of native allies who hated Aztec wool, and with an invisible weapon nobody controlled, smallpox, which tore through the city before the final siege. That siege lasted nearly 3 months in 1521, street by street, until the empire surrendered in the rubble. And 12 years later, 3,000 kilometers south, history repeated itself, almost word for word. The Inca Empire was the largest state in the Americas, and when the Spaniards landed, it was already dying. Smallpox had raced ahead of them along the empire's own magnificent roads, killing the emperor and igniting a civil war between his sons. In 1532, at Cajamarca, Francisco Pizarro ambushed the victorious brother, Atahualpa, with about 168 men. The emperor offered the most famous ransom in history, a room filled once with gold and twice with silver. His people delivered it. 13,000 pounds of gold, 26,000 pounds of silver. The Spaniards melted centuries of art into bars, and in July of 1533, executed him anyway. An empire of millions, decapitated in a single afternoon by men who had already been paid to leave. The next empire did not fall in an afternoon. It spent an entire century being told it was dying. The Ottoman Empire ruled for over 600 years, across 3 continents.
and spent its final century nicknamed the sick man of Europe. Everyone knew it was declining. That is the cruelest way an empire can go. Slowly, in full view, borrowing money it cannot repay from the very rivals waiting to carve it up. By the 1870s, the empire was effectively bankrupt, its finances managed by foreign creditors. It picked the losing side of the First World War, and in 1922, the Sultanate was abolished. The last sultan, heir to 6 centuries of conquerors, left his capital quietly aboard a British warship. Which brings us to the final empire on this list, the biggest one in human history, and the fastest to disappear. And here is where the pattern you have been watching pays off. The British Empire, by the 1920s, covered roughly a quarter of the planet's land and a quarter of its people, the largest empire that has ever existed. A child born at that peak could have watched within one ordinary lifetime India leave in 1947, the colonies leave one by one, and Hong Kong handed back in 1997, not conquered, dissolved. Because the 2 world wars had turned the empire into something no empire survives, a possession that costs more to hold than it returns. Britain made the final payment on its Second World War loans in 2006. That is the mistake almost every empire on this list made. The drought empires outgrew their water.
The military empires outgrew their armies. The trading empires outgrew their credit. Every one of them kept expanding past the point where holding the prize cost more than the prize was worth. They did not fall because they were weak. They fell because they were too big to afford. Nine empires, one invoice. So here is my question for you. Which of these collapses should Chronica cover in full? An entire deep dive on just one fall. Rome's long bleed, the Mongol family war, the room full of gold. Tell me in the comments, because the next episodes come from exactly there. And if you learned something your schoolbook skipped, subscribe. Chronica explains all of history, one complete catalog at a time.